Hello, everybody. It's Friday, August the 15th, 2025. We've been focusing on power and electricity a lot in the show recently. We did a show a couple of days ago with Geoffrey Hinton, just won the Nobel Prize for Physics, the godfather of AI, who spoke to us about AI taking us over. And of course, in a way, it's about the power of AI, the electricity of AI taking us over. We also did a show yesterday with Martin Rees, very distinguished astrophysicist, who argues that the biggest existential threat to humanity isn't AI, it's network collapse, which is also, of course, very much bound up with the question of power and electricity. A few weeks ago, we did a show with the economic historian Dror Poleg, whose narrative of the AI revolution is built around electricity, the economics, perhaps even the philosophy of electricity. So electricity has been a theme. And in fact, in yesterday's New York Times, there was a cover story about, and I'm quoting the title, "Big Tech's AI data centers are driving up electricity bills for everyone." So the question of our future of electricity and power is increasingly a political one, and I guess in a way a cultural one, which leads us to my guest today. Isabelle Boemeke is Brazilian, a former model, now an advocate for nuclear energy. She has a new book out this week. It's called Rad Future, The Untold Story of Nuclear Electricity and How It Will Save the World. Isabelle is joining us from her home in a rather steamy Austin. How hot is it down there, Isabelle?
It's very hot. I don't know the exact temperature, but it's hot enough that you don't want to be outside. That's all I know.
So, of course, the other narrative which is dominating our existential times is global warming. Is there a connection between the arguments you make in Rad Future, The Untold Story of Nuclear Electricity and How It Will Save the World, and what most people indeed see as our existential crisis of the climate?
Well, the whole reason why I ended up writing this book was because I myself experienced what's called climate anxiety back in 2019. And this is a very specific sort of anxiety that maybe started with people my generation. I'm a millennial, but also younger people as well, where they fear climate change so much. They fear that their lives as they know it, or even the planet, might end in a decade or so. That they feel they don't want to have kids, they don't even want to invest in their future. So back in 2019, I remember, waking up one day and doing the very bad thing of checking social media first thing in the morning and seeing photos of the Amazon rainforest on fire. And earlier that same year, or around the same time, I had witnessed the Australian bushfires. I don't know if you remember that. It was all over the news back then. And also that same year, there were these horrifying pictures of California's orange skies, which were also caused by wildfire.
No, those orange skies were particularly ominous in San Francisco. We woke up one morning and it seemed as if the world was coming to an end.
Right. And that's how I felt as well. And as I mentioned, people my generation and younger, we grew up with the fear of climate change. It was very much something that was always in the back of our minds. But it always felt to me like a future problem, something that was going to happen sometime, not necessarily in the present. But seeing those images, and especially the Amazon fires, because I'm from Brazil, so that felt more emotional for me. I became very depressed about the state of our world and also in our lack of progress of addressing this crisis. Now, I think people get caught up in the details of, is it an existential crisis? Does it mean humanity as a whole would vanish from the earth? We don't know exactly, if everybody on earth would die, but we know for sure that it will cause a lot of pain, a lot of deaths, a lot of migration caused by climate change induced droughts, floods, and wildfires. So it's very, very connected. This is the motivation behind my entire work.
I got to be careful here what I say, Isabelle, so you can slap me around if I'm in any way patronizing. But, You're an unusual character. You went from being a high-profile Brazilian model to being an advocate of nuclear power. Just had an interesting cover story in the New York Times. And I'm sure you were half amused by this, they described you as looking like the heroine of a dystopian novel, which I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult, maybe a little bit of both. But the real question, of course, or at least the question that comes to my mind, is it's one thing to be anxious. It's one thing to wake up in the morning and fear that the world is coming to an end, and you claim to speak on behalf of your generation, which may or may not be true. But where do you get the scientific know-how to be able to write a book about nuclear power?
Well, I always like to make the joke about Greta Thunberg because she wrote a book about climate change and she never finished high school. So I can say that I have finished high school, at least. If you're going to listen to Greta, but not listen to me for that reason, you're a hypocrite. But it's a fair question. And if you read the book, I say right up front, I'm not pretending to be a nuclear engineer. I'm more of a translator. And every piece of data in the book has been fact-checked by multiple people. I have a team of incredible nuclear engineers that have helped, they offer to help fact-check the book. And of course, when you publish a book, it goes through fact-checking as well in the process. So the facts themselves are all fact-checked by experts. The role I play is in translating all that super complex information into things that people can understand. And also, I think more importantly, that people want to engage with, because one problem of a lot of tech-heavy materials, be it a book or documentaries or social media content, is that people find it boring. And I take a lot of pride in the fact that my book, so far, all the reviews say that it's very entertaining, very fast-paced. People usually finish reading it in a couple of days. And that's my strength.
I take that point. And of course, this is a very serious subject. But when you woke up that morning, when you saw the fires in the Amazon, when you saw the red sky over San Francisco and all these other horror stories in media, why not concentrate on something less controversial than nuclear power? As everybody knows, nuclear power is an enormously controversial subject. We have the issue, of course, of nuclear weapons, although they're not always as connected as some people might think. But there also, of course, have been the disasters of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. Why not focus, given your anxiety and worry about the future of the world, why not focus on something less controversial?
The focus was precisely because of how controversial it was. It's because when I looked into the solutions, I quickly realized that nuclear was the only possible solution to climate change, meaning a clean energy source that had this huge PR problem. And when I started investigating and learning more about nuclear, I quickly realized that a lot of it is based on misconceptions. And I'll use your comment/question as an example. For example, you mentioned the disasters of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. And yes, Chernobyl was a disaster. 3 Mile Island was not a disaster. It was a small accident that had no impact whatsoever on people's health. The amount of radiation released in the environment was tiny, and every single scientific study that's come out since then has confirmed that there is no increase in cancers and that nobody died. So this was not a disaster. It just so happened that the accidents took place 12 days after the China Syndrome, which was a huge Hollywood movie about a nuclear power plant accident, came out. And this movie featured Jane Fonda as, the lead character. And just the timing, the sequence of events was such that it created an insane amount of anxiety from everyone who witnessed the accident. And what were some of the other questions you raised? Oh, the connection to nuclear weapons. This is another great example, right? I believe that when we started developing nuclear electricity, the connection to weapons was still fairly uncertain. We didn't really know if every country that was able to develop nuclear electricity would end up developing weapons. But now we have a lot of data. And out of the 31 countries in the world that have nuclear electricity, only 7 of them have weapons. And 5 of them already had weapons before they developed nuclear reactors for electricity. So the connection, yes, I'm not going to claim like it's non-existent, but in reality, most countries just want to have access to cheap, reliable electricity more than they want to develop nuclear weapons. And furthermore, if countries are hell-bent on developing weapons, they can do so without pretending to have a nuclear electricity program. As a matter of fact, it would be easier. That's what.
Well, of course, that's the. I don't want to. I'm guessing it's probably not the core of your book, but the whole question of Iran and nuclear power is another issue. And to be fair to what you're saying, there was a headline in the Financial Times, which I trust probably more than any other publication, from a couple of days ago, suggesting that only 1% of Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors died from radiation cancers, for better or worse. Of course, we're living at the anniversary, something not to be celebrated, of the dropping of an atomic weapon on Nagasaki. So for me, as a non-scientific person, put your rad language, your rad future into use, Isabelle. Is there a connection between nuclear weapons and nuclear power? Why do we use the same word?
Well, because both use the underlying science of splitting atoms to generate energy, right? In the case of nuclear weapons, is an uncontrolled chain reaction. In the case of nuclear reactors, is a controlled chain reaction. And when you think about the discovery of nuclear fission, which took place in 1938 in Germany, there wasn't a worse time for this discovery to take place. We were a year away from entering World War II, and of course discovered in Germany, where Hitler was most likely trying to develop a bomb as soon as that discovery took place. And so back then, Einstein co-wrote a letter to President Roosevelt at the time, urging him to, basically start a weapons development program, because the fear was that, again, Hitler was trying to develop a bomb. And that's what kickstarted the Manhattan Project. And of course, the Manhattan Project, a couple of years later, results in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which you just brought up. And that's how the world was introduced to nuclear technologies. So imagine that every time somebody hears the word nuclear, especially if they are of an older generation, I have to say I didn't have this issue because I did not grow up with those images as prevalent as older folks. But for an entire generation, every time you heard the word nuclear, the first image that comes to mind is, a mushroom cloud. And
understandably,
of course. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. But that's what has caused the very strong emotional reaction to nuclear electricity. It's that for an entire generation, there is that connection to the bombs. But as I said, we have proven that these are completely separate technologies with opposite goals. One of them is of ending life, and the other one is creating life. And we have been able, through strong international cooperations, to develop electricity while at least slowing the spread of nuclear weapons.
Let's be clear, there's not, I think, consensus within the scientific community. I've got Bill McKibben, another of the world's leading environmentalists, coming on the show next week, and I need to remember to ask him his take on nuclear power. Let me ask you another, maybe, Isabelle, this is another dumb question.
Right, you said there's no consensus on what exactly?
On what you're arguing about, because if there was, you probably wouldn't need to write the book anyway.
Well, there are 31 countries in the world that have nuclear electricity, and only 7 of them have weapons. I think that's proof that not every country that develops nuclear reactors for electricity develops weapons, right?
Yeah, no one's arguing that. But
okay, so what's
the issue about whether or not it's safe, the question, again, of nuclear power versus electricity is a complex one.
I'm sorry, I have to push back on that. There's question whether it's safe.
Well, so what's the standard critique then of nuclear power? Why do some people argue against it? What's the problem?
Well, there are several arguments. One of them is that it's, to your point, unsafe, and
and you're saying that's entirely wrong.
In terms of an electricity generating source of energy?
No, in terms of its dangers. When you say safe, why do critics of nuclear energy suggest that it's unsafe?
Right. So that whenever they say nuclear electricity is not safe, they'll point to Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, right? They'll point to those accidents and say, see, nuclear is not safe. But that would be the same as pointing to a couple of airplane crashes and say, airplanes are not safe. When you look at the data of transportation, you know that airplanes are actually one of the safest forms of transportation. And the same is true for nuclear. When you look at the data of deaths per terawatt hour of generated electricity, nuclear ends up being as safe as solar and wind. Hydropower, as a matter of fact, has killed way more people than nuclear has.
Yeah, but it's like that old, you've spent some time in the Bay Area in Berkeley, you've probably been there. There's an old bumper sticker of old leftists in Berkeley, which always used to say, I'm not sure if they still have it, a nuclear war can ruin your day. It's one thing for an airline to crash, and that's not a great thing, especially if you're on board. It's quite another for there to be some sort of nuclear catastrophe of some
Well, okay,
sort.
but we're talking very different things. I'm talking about nuclear electricity, which is electricity generated from nuclear power plants. You're talking about nuclear weapons. Those are very different technologies. I'm completely against nuclear weapons. I wish we could get rid of them. I don't think we should have nuclear wars. I hope we don't get into a nuclear war. But I think this is an interesting conversation because you're obviously of an older generation and you are the perfect person I'm talking about, which is you cannot in your brain separate both things. And they're different technologies. And yet you keep going back to the weapons, even though I'm talking about...
Well, I'm not going back to the weapons. I'm just talking about what I was doing was asking you what the concern is. Are you suggesting that the only people who are suspicious of nuclear power are an older generation who can't get the idea of nuclear weapons out of their mind? There's no other credible critique?
No, but you're saying... You said there are stickers in Berkeley that say nuclear war something. And I said, yes, I don't want nuclear war. I don't want nuclear weapons. I want nuclear electricity, which is a very different technology.
Let me ask you another question about nuclear, about electricity. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you get this question all the time as well. Why isn't and if there's such a thing as conventional electricity or non-nuclear electricity, why isn't that sufficient? What's the environmental problem with electricity? We have electric vehicles that are supposed to be good for the environment. We have solar-powered energy. What's wrong with those forms of energy? Is it an either-or are you arguing in Rad Future that we really only need nuclear power?
Oh, no. I argue in Red Future that we need all sources of clean energy. And the way, clean energy is broadly defined as low carbon energy sources. So what's wrong with our existing energy sources? Well, we mostly rely on fossil fuels for everything, including for electricity generation, because electricity is a secondary form of energy. We can't go into the environment and grab electricity and to power our things. We have to generate electricity with a primary source of energy. And primary sources of energy can be fossil fuels, things like methane gas, coal, or oil. It can also be solar, wind, geothermal, hydro. Now, nuclear is just one primary source of energy that whenever we use nuclear energy to make electricity, that process doesn't release greenhouse gases, which make climate change worse. It also doesn't release particulate matter, which is of significant concern with fossil fuel sources of energy like gas, oil, and coal. So these are tiny little pollution particles that get lodged into our lungs, and they create all sorts of problems. And the very conservative estimate is that at least 4 million people die every single year from this pollution problem alone. So, that, in my opinion, is something that we should improve upon. I think one realization I had after writing the book is that the way we should think about technological progress is a technology that gives us something equal or at least very close to a previous technology, but that lowers our impact on human health and the environment. And nuclear, to me, but also solar and wind and geothermal and so on, those are perfect examples, right? We're able to provide electricity in the same way that we could with fossil fuels, but we're lowering the impact on human health and the environment as well.
There's a lot riding on this issue. There's a huge developing industry. There was a piece about you in the Wall Street Journal. Nuclear power is having a pop culture moment, and you are the pop cultural icon, who the pin-up in a way, the ex-model, who has become the poster child of the nuclear energy issue. The New York Times, and again, I know you're all too familiar with this, they ask why you're doing this, and they suggest that they quote you as saying you've never taken money from the industry. So I'm not going to ask you about that, but the financial implications of this, the wins and the losses are massive in this debate, aren't they?
The wins and the losses, I think the wins for the human species as a whole is massive. If we can phase out of fossil fuels and transition to clean energy sources that are not going to kill 4 million people every single year and that are not going to cause climate change, the wins are massive, and the losses are also massive. I believe that without nuclear, we will delay our transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy by a couple of decades, if not at least more. So yeah, they're huge.
So tell me a little bit about this incipient nuclear energy industry. You've been involved in something called Diablo Canyon. Is there a public debate about whether or not we should allow it? And who's behind Diablo Canyon? Are these private organizations, or is this the American government? I know Donald Trump's quite sympathetic in some ways to nuclear power, as, to be fair, as Sam Altman and Bill Gates. There's some very prominent technological figures are involved in this debate.
Well, that's what's so cool about nuclear, in my opinion, is that it has truly bipartisan support. As a matter of fact, it might be the only energy source that has bipartisan support. The Biden administration was extremely pro-nuclear. They passed a lot of incentives to nuclear power plants in the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Trump administration is very pro-nuclear as well. As a matter of fact, while they cut subsidies for other clean energy sources, they mostly maintained all the ones for nuclear. So it's amazing to see this level.
Who's against it then? So you're making it sound like it's a no-brainer. It's apple pie, that you'd be either an old fart like myself or some sort of reactionary to be against it. Who's arguing against this?
I don't know. You seem to be. Let's go. Tell me why you're arguing against it.
No, I'm asking you. I'm conducting the interview. Who's against it?
Oh, so who's against it? There are, I think, still some people who were a part of the environmental movement in the 70s who...
You mean like old Berkeley people?
A lot of Berkeley people.
With their bumper plates, right?
Yeah, yes, a lot of Berkeley. I've never spent a significant amount of time in Berkeley, so I don't know. I'll take your word for it. But a lot of people who belong to the environmental movement in the 70s. But even those people, I mean, Stuart Brand is a famous example of somebody
who's an old friend. He's been on the show. What's his position, Stuart, on this?
Oh, he used to oppose nuclear, and he's now a very vocal proponent. So he's an example of somebody who changed their mind. Another example is Charles Kamenov. He is an environmental lawyer, and he was also very opposed to nuclear in the 70s. He has come around to it. He has written a few pieces about the grave mistake of shutting down existing nuclear power plants, especially the one in New York called Indian Point. It was shut down in 2021. And, every time a nuclear power plant shuts down, politicians will swear up and down that it will be replaced with clean energy. It never happens. It was fully replaced with fossil fuels. It's increased New York emissions by 15%. And, they haven't been able to catch up since then. And so there are a lot of people that have seen those numbers and have come around to it. And I think, I talk about this in the book as well. I understand the fears back then. I probably would have been anti-nuclear in the 70s because it was a newer technology. We didn't know how many accidents would be happening. We didn't know the impact of those accidents. We also didn't know, to your point earlier, we didn't fully understand the connection between weapons and electricity. All of these were great unknowns. But now we have a lot of data, and we have a lot of data that supports that, again, nuclear is as safe as other forms of clean energy, that the connection to weapons was greatly exaggerated. And we just have a lot of information that, allows us to change our mind.
How will this, in your view, impact the world if nuclear energy becomes our dominant form of energy in the 21st century? You're from the southern part of Brazil. You were born there on the border of Uruguay and Argentina and southern Brazil. How will this affect countries outside North America and Western Europe, Japan?
I mean, what's very different about nuclear from other sources of energy is that you create a whole environment around it, right? If a country is going to build nuclear reactors, they have to build a nuclear regulatory system. They have to build their workforce. They have to create special courses in universities and things like that. One of the things I like the most about nuclear is that it needs a lot of workers. So taking Diablo Canyon, for example, in California, which you brought up before, Diablo Canyon has 1,200 employees. These are all high-paying, very stable jobs. They're multi-generational because these plants can last for like 60, 80 years. As a matter of fact, I was just touring Diablo Canyon, and I met a lady who works there. She's Native American, and she is fourth-generation nuclear worker. So her grandfather worked in a nuclear power plant, and her father, she's third, and then her daughter is fourth. So there's 4 generations of people working in nuclear power plants. So it brings a level of how do I say this? It just brings an entire ecosystem that also helps the country develop. And then also, again, providing reliable, clean electricity, which I would make the argument that it is on the West to be able to develop these technologies to a mature stage where we can export and help developing countries leapfrog fossil fuels entirely. There are 600,000 people in the world that don't have access to electricity. It would be amazing if we could provide them access to electricity, but to clean electricity, and not have them go through the entire, coal, oil, methane gas arc.
What's happening in Diablo Canyon? I'm in California. There's a great debate about whether it should stay open. Give me your take on the Diablo Canyon story. Why are people arguing it should be closed?
Diablo Canyon is, in many, many ways, the most iconic nuclear power plant in the United States. As you mentioned, is in California. It's near San Luis Obispo. Probably one of the most beautiful landscapes I've ever seen. Certainly the most beautiful nuclear power plant. And it was built in the 60s, or it was proposed in the 60s, but it was built during the 70s and 80s. And it was the background for a lot of anti-nuclear protests. At one point, a famous musician was arrested at the gates of Diablo Canyon. Jane Fonda was there protesting. Apparently, workers had to be airlifted to the plant because they couldn't drive through the sea of people protesting this plant being built. And so in many ways, it represents the birth of the anti-nuclear movement in the United States. And the plant was going to be shut down in August of this year, actually, in like 10 days. And the reasons that were given were economical, but in reality, it was a political move. So what happened was Jerry Brown, who was governor of California 4 times, ran back in the first time he ran on the platform of shutting down Diablo Canyon, of preventing Diablo Canyon from operating. So this was a very, very long-term goal that he had. And every step of the way, different people had tried shutting down this plant. It was, again, announced in 2016 or 2018 it was finalized, but it was announced in 2016 that it was going to be shut down in 2025. And it was considered a huge win for the anti-nuclear movement. However, in 2021, as we started getting closer to the date of the closure, it became very apparent that shutting down Diablo Canyon would be a huge mistake. This plant alone at the time provided 10% of California's electricity. It's the largest source of clean energy in the state. And California had clean electricity mandates. It also had recently passed a electric vehicle mandate, and you brought this technology up again. You know, when you think about electric vehicles, the time where most people charge their electric vehicle is at night. And nuclear, you know, is a reliable source of clean energy that works at night, unlike solar. And so it would create all this stress on the Californian grid, which was already struggling at the time. There were constant risks of blackouts. To this day, in the summertime, people get alerts on their phone asking, you might get this as well during the summer, asking people to, you know, stop their air conditioning or not use electric technology after a certain time as to not stress the grid and not cause blackouts. And so all of this combined made very, very clear that shutting down Diablo Canyon was going to be a poor decision. And
the big investment, of course, or the company that's massively invested in this is Pacific Gas and Electricity, PG&E. There's a great debate about the $43 million in nuclear power plant related costs. So there are corporate complexities to this narrative, aren't there?
I mean, there are always, right? There are corporations.
Not always, but I mean, so what's PG&E's role in all this?
PG&E's role in
Diablo Canyon.
So PG&E owns Diablo Canyon, but Diablo Canyon has its own, obviously, staff, because PG&E in general is just a utility, right? But Diablo Canyon has their own staff, and it's one of the best operated nuclear plants in the country. I'm not sure I understand the question. What's their role in the campaign to save Diablo?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's in their interest. What about Gavin Newsom? What's his position on this?
Well, so let me just go back. So PG&E never engaged with me or any other advocate. As a matter of fact, I toured Diablo Canyon when I was organizing the campaign to keep it open. And the person who gave us the tour was very adamant that the plant was going to shut down, and they didn't want anything to do with any of us. So this didn't come from PG&E at all. So that's very important to put out.
You mentioned Jerry Brown, of course, who is a classic environmentalist. What about Gavin Newsom's position on this?
Gavin Newsom was pro shutting Diablo Canyon down, and I have to give him a lot of credit. He changed his mind, and one of the reasons he says he changed his mind is because of this letter that I organized and ended up being signed by 79 of the leading climate energy experts and so on in the country that urged him to delay the closure of Diablo Canyon.
You were, and in some ways still are, an influencer. Your new book had a private Hamptons event recently with Gwyneth Paltrow, one of the great influencers. Do you think this is the way for we talked about the environmental movement of the 60s, whether it's environmentalism or nuclear power or anything else, that the influencer culture, influencer way of doing things is the way to shape and reshape the world in the 2020s?
It has always been about influencers. It's just that they change every so often depending on our culture. The anti-nuclear movement was in large part so important because of the influencers that participated in it, including Jane Fonda, who I mentioned before. She's obviously a massive actress. There is there are some negative connotations to the word influencer. However, influencers have always geared public debate and culture, and so I don't think it is the correct way. I don't know what the correct way is. However, I understand that this is a very powerful way, and that is why I've chosen to do the things that I have done, is because I understand that that's what drives conversation and culture.
Isabelle, it seems as if on a broader kind of structural level in the 2020s, we're getting this endless conflict between privately funded businesses and the state. It's happened with space travel. It's happened with the weapons business. Is this part perhaps of, I'm not suggesting you're on one side of this or the other, but given that the electricity business has always been a public utility, is it conceivable that we will begin to see in the future, if indeed nuclear power becomes more ubiquitous, might it be privatized in the same way as Elon Musk? I know you're a good friend of Elon Musk, or at least your husband is a good friend of Elon Musk. The same way as Elon Musk is trying, or had tried, to at least privatize the American government?
So a lot of, the utility companies that are privatized, like PG&E is a private company, and so are all the other ones. I think the interesting thing about nuclear, if you look historically, in every country that has been very successful at deploying nuclear, there has been a strong support from the government. So in the case of France, it's probably the most obvious example. In the 70s, when the world experienced the first oil shock, France went all in on nuclear. And in 15 years, they built 57 reactors, and they dropped their emissions per unit of electricity by 79%. Even though at the time this had nothing to do with climate change. This was purely an energy independence and energy reliance issue. And this, largely came from EDF, which is a government-owned utility company. The same is true in China. Obviously, China is now the world's leader in, I would say, in deploying nuclear electricity. Same thing is true in Russia. In the United States, actually, one of the reasons why it has not been so successful is precisely because you have this very fragmented industry, right? Where you have one utility company might build a couple of reactors, but they're not going to build more than 5 or 6, so they're not bringing those learnings. And they're all different. They're all building different reactor designs. So again, you're not accumulating the learnings, which is what actually brings the cost down and makes it faster to build nuclear power plants.
So you're saying that if nuclear is going to catch on, it's probably more likely on the French statist model than the American decentralized privatized model?
Or there are companies in the United States that are now trying to become developers of nuclear. So instead of having a utility, the utility themselves build a couple of nuclear reactors and lose all of the learnings. There are companies that are now trying to go and build nuclear reactors for different utilities. So they do accumulate the learned experience, but still it needs a lot of government support. It needs access to lots of capital at low interest rates. This is also historically what enables a successful nuclear deployment. And certainly in the beginning right now, because a lot of people don't appreciate that nuclear was dead in the United States for 3 decades. So imagine an industry where for 30 years, nobody's building anything new. So until we get to a point where there is momentum, it's going to need a lot of subsidies from the government.
In an odd way, there's a symmetry, kind of intellectually, structurally, with crypto in an odd way. Is there, or am I wrong?
In what way exactly?
Well, in a fundamentally different way, just as crypto is a fundamentally different way of thinking about 20th century or 19th, 20th century finance. The same is true when it comes to energy and nuclear.
I don't know. I don't see the connection, but I would love for you to expand upon it.
Maybe I'll have to write a book. I'll call it Rad Future 2.0.
You know what? I do have. I don't. Did you get a chance to read the book?
I got a chance to look at the book.
Okay.
Finally, Isabelle, a lot of people are going to be reading this or thinking about it and thinking maybe Isabelle has a point. When it comes to car, electric vehicles, of course, you can go out and buy a Tesla or an EV. When it comes to solar power, you can put solar panels on your roof. But when it comes to a nuclear electricity, for people who are intrigued by what you're arguing, I mean, obviously they can read the book, buy the book Rad Future. They might even go and demonstrate, as you did at Diablo Canyon. But what else can people do to pursue your dream of saving the world?
Well, there are many, many things that people can do. Obviously, promote clean energy sources. And this is what the last part of my book, or the last chapter in my book, is exactly that, telling people what they can do if they have, learned more about nuclear, they feel like it should be a part of the solutions to climate change. What they can do, first of all, is honestly just talk to other people. When I started this whole journey, one of the reasons why I decided this work was important is because I started testing it with people. So I would go on an airplane and sit next to somebody, and they would ask, what do you do? I would say, I'm a nuclear energy influencer. And they would be completely blown away. And they would have all sorts of questions, like some that you brought up. What about Chernobyl? What about the weapons? And it always ended up being an engaging conversation. People are very curious about this topic, and they don't know anything. So if you can share any sort of information, that's already helpful. Then obviously you can take many steps further. You can just stick to the conversations, or you can be somebody on social media that's going and commenting on people who are talking about nuclear. If they're spreading misinformation, flagging that out. You can also join an organization and write letters to editors, or show up to demonstrations, call your politicians. But I know this all sounds very, very small. It does help, though. And the only piece of data I can share is polling on support for nuclear. So when I started doing this work 5 years ago, 49% of Americans supported adding more nuclear to the grid. Nowadays, that number is 61%. This is almost the highest level of public support in history. And even if I point back to Diablo Canyon and Governor Newsom, I don't know, because I don't have access to a parallel universe where the factors were different. But I'm sure that showing him that there was public support, demonstrating at that rally to show that there were young people who were in favor of keeping the plant open, I'm sure that at least gave him the social license to go ahead and publicly change his mind and say, actually, we need to keep this plant open. Politicians respond really well to what their constituents want. And so that does have an impact. And then the other thing I always recommend is also, if you're donating to an environmental group or any other nonprofit organization that talks about energy issues, make sure that they support, or at least are not vehemently opposed to nuclear. I'll just bring one example up. The NRDC, which is one of the most famous environmental organizations in the United States, was in large part responsible for the shutdown of Indian Point in New York, which again was fully replaced by fossil fuels and and jumped the fossil fuel emissions. Sorry. Weird.
That was the NRDC.
That was the NRDC cops calling me. And so those are all little things.
So these are the bad guys, at least in your mind, the NRDC. I'll have to ask Bill McKibben. As I said, he's coming on the show next week. But you've done a very good job, Isabelle, imagining a rad future, telling us about the story of nuclear electricity and how it will save the world. Very compelling narrative, and a very credible one, an important subject. It's not going away, especially with AI. So congratulations on the new book. Wonderful to have you on the show. And I'll have to get you back. Maybe we'll find someone from the NRDC or Bill McKibben or someone else to debate with you. Thank you so much.